Hello, I'm Hemanth Venkataraman, and in this video I will summarize the main points in my capstone paper that I recently submitted as a final step in earning my Master of Science degree in Restorative Practices from the International Institute for Restorative Practices. My capstone paper presents 3 of the most transformative ideas that I emerged with during my graduate coursework. These are ideas that really connect with who I am as an individual and what I believe to be my professional calling. They have profoundly impacted my life, and I believe that they have far-reaching implications for society. My first transformative idea was that the field of restorative practices is inextricably linked to our nation's racial history. Now, I've been invested in understanding race and racism since childhood, when I first experienced the sting of racism and being othered, and then throughout my career as an educator and restorative practitioner, witnessing the disproportionality in school discipline in my own district. For example, Black students are suspended more often and longer than students of other races for the exact same infractions. In a recent year, Black and Latinx youth represented 91% of arrests in New York City schools, despite being only 66% of the population. From experience, I knew that restorative practices can dismantle this kind of disproportionality, teaching schools to use alternatives to zero tolerance punishments and exclusionary punishments. But during my graduate coursework, I realized that the connection between restorative practices and racial equity goes much deeper than that. I was particularly inspired by a quote from Diné elder Indigenous rights advocate George Erasmus, who said, "Where common memory is lacking, where people do not share in the same past, there can be no real community. Where community is to be formed, common memory must be created." 80% of restorative practices consists of proactive measures to build relationships and communities characterized by trust and empathy. But how can we be a community if I'm unaware of the devastating impacts of chattel slavery or Jim Crow or land seizures or internment camps on the student or staff member sitting next to me? How can we be a community if the reality of my ancestors is different from yours, with a lasting effect that I've never even considered? So it dawned on me, amidst our nation's racial upheaval that erupted in the spring of 2020, and as schools began to approach me with vague requests to introduce restorative justice or to address racial equity, I decided to use the following message with school leaders. All right, you want me to bring restorative practices to your community because you've heard that it's a way to make school discipline more racially equitable. Fine, we can get there, but we are skipping some key steps. Restorative practices is about connection, belongingness, community. But we can't have community without common memory, a shared past in the words of Erasmus. But we can't have common memory without explicitly teaching about our history of racial oppression, including the most painful and uncomfortable truths. So if this is about more than just checking a box to meet some district requirement, and we really want to see progress, this is how we're going to do it. Now, keep in mind, the subject is so uncomfortable for most people that proactive restorative practices are also necessary just to have a baseline of connection and empathy that allows people to even embark on a journey towards shifting mindsets about race. So, for example, we'll use staff circles to promote trust, belongingness, transparency, vulnerability, even before we mention race. And then these efforts to teach history and establish community restoratively are mutually dependent, and they're going to take place simultaneously. Plus, beyond community building, restorative practices will provide the most effective protocols to discuss the lasting impact of racial oppression. And these protocols are going to enable educators to listen deeply and purposefully to their colleagues and students, empathizing as they hear others' stories and the associated feelings, needs, and values. So in my paper, I discuss how I brought these ideas to life in schools, the initial feedback from educators that suggests that mindsets are shifting, and what this may mean for the future of education and racial healing in our country. The second transformative idea that emerged during my graduate studies is that the mutualistic relationship between restorative practices and mindfulness creates the conditions that transform learning communities. To understand this relationship requires us to first understand that stress impedes restorative practices. Restorative practices is about connecting with others, forging relationships, leading to tight-knit communities. But stress obstructs our ability to connect with others. Repeated exposure to trauma and repeated activation of the body's stress response system damage the parts of our brain that enable us to have healthy relationships. The stress hormone cortisol is released in excess, altering the brain's architecture. The prefrontal cortex shrinks, making it difficult to regulate emotions. The constant activation of the amygdala, responsible for our fight, flight, or freeze state, leaves many of us in a perpetual state of hyper-defensiveness. Stress even impairs a specific social cognitive mechanism known as social working memory, which corresponds to difficulties with social connection. All right, so that means if we want to introduce restorative practices to a community, we have to help its members minimize the effects of stress. And mindfulness-based practices, including breathing techniques and meditation, are optimal in combating the physiological damage caused by trauma and stress. Individuals who practice mindfulness experience a reduction in the release of cortisol, and MRI images show growth in the prefrontal cortex and a shrinkage in the amygdala. Breathing techniques have been shown to decrease stress and improve emotional regulation, and even decrease post-traumatic stress disorder in veterans. Meditation has been shown to improve social emotional competencies associated with relationship building, such as resilience, in both students and teachers. And it's not only that mindfulness combats stress so that we can be restorative, but the other direction is true as well. As Annie O'Shaughnessy puts it, restorative practices expands our mindfulness practice beyond the intrapersonal to the interpersonal, cultivating a more compassionate curiosity and relationship with each other. Now, I've been very deliberate since learning these things about using an approach to training and coaching that interweaves restorative practices and mindfulness-based practices. This can involve using breathing techniques during restorative circles, taking a mindful breath before an emotionally charged conversation, or using meditation to help folks become aware of their bodily sensations, and then their feelings, and then their underlying needs that are not being met and leading to stress and conflict. I found that individuals are much more able to approach both community building and repairing harm with openness, curiosity, and a lack of judgment. Educators are realizing that restorative practices is not a fixed curriculum or a program. It's less something you do and more a way of being around each other. And by being more mindful, in tune with our own feelings and needs, and receptive to the feelings of others, we're already a restorative community before we even implement any restorative practices explicitly. During my graduate studies, I learned that restorative practices are directly related to the health and well-being of individuals and entire communities. My third transformative idea is actually a collection of realizations, innovations, and professional steps that were inspired by this relationship. We know that restorative practices promote social connection and develop community. What I didn't realize was that social connection plays such a critical role in our physical and mental health. Human beings are wired to connect. We're the only species utterly dependent on friendship and companionship. Social connection is not a luxury. It's as crucial to our survival as food and shelter. Individuals with adequate social relationships have a 50% greater likelihood of survival compared to those with poor or insufficient social relationships. The magnitude of that effect is comparable with quitting smoking and exceeds many well-known risk factors for mortality. Honestly, to me, the link between social connection and our physical health, mental health, and even our survival was mind-blowing. And if that's true, then when we do restorative practices in schools, there should be some measurable effects on student health, right? Absolutely. In one example, the whole school approach to restorative practices reduced the odds of physical health-related absences by 16%. When I shared the health implications of restorative practices with doctors, nurses, and pharmacists, they were fascinated. We realized that the training that I was offering to educators was just as relevant to healthcare professionals, and the needs in healthcare were analogous to those in schools. And I was invited to introduce restorative practices as a health and well-being intervention to medical residents and pharmacy students. We discussed health equity and racial disparities in access to health resources and incidences of deadly diseases. By introducing restorative protocols for sharing and listening, we discussed the destructive effects of implicit bias in their industry. For example, in 2016, over 40% of white doctors actually believed the myth that Black people have thicker skin than people of other races. As we discussed how such biases have led to the systematic undertreatment of Black patients reporting pain, participants shared vulnerably and listened empathetically, with some even moved to tears. I offered restorative practices as a solution to promote health equity and to reach resistant patients by focusing on relationships and trust. Using an ecological model of health behavior, we considered what institutional and policy level changes would need to occur in their profession in order to prioritize social connection at all stages of patient care. We also focused on the intrapersonal factors that influence health behaviors by discussing some fundamental questions. Has the doctor studied history in order to form common memory with his or her patients and their community? Has the doctor spent time examining implicit biases that may interfere with providing optimal care? At the end of the day, does the doctor view patients as partners or just projects? Exploring this third transformative idea has been tremendously rewarding, and I'm excited to continue to offer restorative practices to healthcare practitioners in the future. In closing, my experiences over the past 2 years have truly been life-changing. Immersing myself in restorative practices has impacted my personal relationships, opened my mind to new ways of thinking about the world and my role in it, and given me new purpose in my professional life as a restorative practices advocate and trainer.